Can you hear me, Ben?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, for some reason my camera is not working, but I'm just gonna roll until I find a way to fix it. Well,
Perfect.
I just want to start and say, thank everyone for joining us for another episode of Making Sense. My name is Daniel Lee. I serve on the board of directors of Move to Amend. I'm joined here today with Ben Gordon of, is it the Public Banking Alliance, Ben?
Yeah, part of a number of affiliations. One is California Public Banking Alliance and also Public Bank Los Angeles and the National Public Banking Alliance.
Great to have you here. I
Thank
will
you.
continue to work on my video, but in the meantime, let's just jump into it, jump into the week. I want to start by first reminding folks that Move to Amend is a coalition that's working to get an amendment to the Constitution that says corporations are not people and money is not speech. Basically, getting rid of all corporate constitutional rights and the notion of corporate personhood. We believe that rights are only for people and perhaps for animals and Mother Earth, but not for artificial entities such as corporations. We feel that giving these corporations rights is inherently a subversion of democracy. So we're working as hard as we can um, to really bring true democracy to the United States, because we think there's some great debate about whether or not we've ever actually been a democracy that really encouraged full participation from people of all shapes and stripes. Making sense, of course, this year we've been talking about and trying to give people a venue to process all of the crazy stuff that has been happening at an unwarranted clip every week this year. And this week is no different. After our lackluster stimulus earlier this year, in which most people received a... Okay. I'm going to stop for a second, Ben, if you don't mind. I'm going to try to jump off and jump back on to see if my video will pop up, and then we'll get back to the conversation.
That would be awesome. Yeah. Yeah, already seeing the comments streaming in and couldn't agree more with a lot of these. And Cindy, thank you for sharing that. That's a huge piece of litigation effort that definitely does not get enough press. And I think here we go.
So once again, thank you, Ben, for joining us. Really happy to have you here because I feel like a lot of people are rejoicing that, in particular, Joe Biden won the election. But I think there's to some degree, a lack of understanding about like the depth of the problem that we'll still be facing with any president. So first, I want to talk about, just to sort of set the stage, some of the things that have come down the pike this week, and then some possible solutions that I think the notion of public banking could help us get to. The first thing, as I was talking about before I jumped off, is just sort of the lackluster stimulus that we had earlier this year. I mean, we've seen other countries Both provide unemployment insurance, but provide up to $2,000 a month, like our neighbors to the north, to all of their residents who are experiencing financial hardship, and other types of support where, in the US, it's been 6 months, 8 months, however long since our first stimulus. And that's all we've received. And it really speaks to what we value here as a country. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts first just on that first stimulus, and how inadequate it was and how much it really just didn't really, it showed how much of a break there is between our elected representatives and the struggles that people are going through from day to day. Just wondering if you have.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That notion of budget your values couldn't apply more here. We see, because we think a lot of times it's easy to talk about things in terms of money because it's easy to compare because it's a number and it's relative, but a lot of it is what winners are being chosen, and we see and what powers and rights are given to who. And so we saw that a lot, not only in 2008-9, but also most recently with the CARES Act and the multiple approaches, in which we see that when it comes to our corporations and when it comes to investors and the richest, that is basically carte blanche, continue what you're doing. We don't want to interrupt it in any clip. For instance, the Federal Reserve opening their window to commercial paper, which basically means if you're a big private company, keep doing what you're doing. McDonald's, for instance, was able to borrow at, I think, about 1%. Took them a few days to do that. And then for the vast majority of us, what we get is an amount that everyone knows is too little. And then it not only is too little, but it also has to go through a system that hasn't worked for the people it was meant to support. And so it's kind of that, at some point it becomes not about that idea of like, oh, is it a conspiracy, the backdoor dealing? But it's like, you got to assume at some point that it is a power struggle, and it's really showing that there are people trying to use the tools of government to really work for a very small group of people because they think that's the way it should be.
Well,
and yeah.
When you were speaking earlier, it made me think of like the PPP, and I know we talked about that. Like a lot of people around the internet did very early when places like Chris received PPP loans. But in the last week, we found that Tom Brady, the former New England Patriots quarterback, current Tampa Bay quarterback, also received a PPP loan that was similar in price to a yacht that he bought a couple weeks later. And then also this week, we found out that a number of companies that our own governor, Gavin Newsom, is tied to similarly received these loans. And, what you're saying and what you're saying, what you initially started saying had me think of the PPP and the notion of them as loans, because, more or less, if you fulfill a few steps and you click a few check boxes, you don't have to pay it back. And that made me think about and I think most of the American public's archaic understanding of the Federal Reserve. And the fact that, like oftentimes, we loan out money, we the people, to some degree, but the Federal Reserve is so complicated that saying we seems like not completely accurate. But like at 0%, to very, very large companies, many of whom have been responsible for our financial turpitude, many of who have been responsible for the negative state of the economy. But when people talk about things like student loan forgiveness, or even just lowering student loan interest rates, everybody's head explodes. And it's like, okay, so is what you said true? Is it that the people who govern our monetary policy think certain people deserve this money, and certain people should have it, and then these others, well, they're just going to have to work, and if they get somewhere eventually, great, but we're not going to help them out? Like, I mean, because that's what it feels like to me.
Yeah, no, I think a few things come to mind. First, just as it concerns the PPP, about it working for some and not others. It's basically they were trying to. If we look at a couple other countries that did direct payroll support, which basically means that anyone on a payroll, all companies have an account at the IRS. It could have happened as it did in many other countries in which the payroll was just supported directly. Instead, it was, let's use the channel of our banking infrastructure to get the loans out, because that allows banks to retain power and also make some money while doing it. And exactly what happened was what anyone would have expected to happen, that people and businesses with relationships existing with banks were the ones that got the loans. And so that's why we see huge discrepancies in not only the race and gender of the people and businesses that got loans, but also really just how much money they already had. And the idea that it's much easier to do one $10 million loan than a whole bunch of $100,000 loans. But then this brings up, if we look at North Dakota, which has the only public bank in the 50 states, America Samoa recently chartered one. But if you look at their lending patterns, their public bank basically supports what you could call like their frontline lenders, where you have local banks, CDFIs, and other and credit unions doing the lending, and they were able to have the most diverse and the most number of small business loans per capita because of the support given by their public bank, which also, you brought up student loans, was able to, I don't remember if it was forgive or just pause a very large number of student loans for people in that state. And so it shows that we have a system in place here, and if it's designed to be democratic and open and accountable to people, you get something more akin to, say, North Dakota. But right now that's the exception and not the rule. And then just the last point, what you brought up about the Fed, we really have to think about it that the Federal Reserve System, what we call the Fed, they need us. They have a dual mandate for employment and interest. And so basically, the way the Fed is currently designed, the only way for them to really drop money into the economy is through banks. They can't directly do it to people. They could with very small fixes. There's bills in Congress right now, whether it's through Fed accounts, which are every individual in the country would have an account at the Fed just like the bank does, and you could easily drop money into the real economy. But right now, they can only do it through banks with an account at the Fed. And what that means is we're now one step removed from getting that money, because they then have to make loans. And if they don't want to make loans in the real economy, or they only want to do it to a subset of businesses, or really just continue doing it in the financial economy, the big difference being the real economy is things like social and environmental actual work, and then say actual businesses. The financial economy are all what you could think of as like derivatives. Their value is derived from real things happening. So it's an agreement. It's basically like a taxpayer guaranteed gambling house. And that's what we generally call Wall Street. So if they're going after the biggest return, and that's in the financial economy, we all get left out. And so we're a step removed from getting direct access to these money drops.
I'm curious what like the barrier is or the opposition is to individual Fed accounts. I imagine, there are arguments that it's, it would be difficult or it's complicated. But and I know in one of the versions of the original Democrats' initial stimulus, there was this idea about creating a digital currency. I'm not sure if that dovetails with Fed accounts, but to my thinking, if the federal government can do a very good job each year of collecting income taxes based on people's social security number or other identification number, if they are not a citizen, then the difficulty question sort of falls away from me. If we already have sort of established structures where we can sort of access people and or their bank accounts directly, because a lot of people do direct deposit, or send them a check, then the argument about like the complications doesn't make sense to me. But I'm curious if you've heard arguments why we just can't make that many accounts. It's too complicated.
No, we hear this a lot. It's really a cover. The main reason why is big banks would have to give up a tremendous amount of monopolized power. So if they're a small group that are the only ones that hold this power, it makes sense they'll do anything to stop it. But then the technological or operational question you bring up is a good one. But in all honesty, it's kind of nonsense. It's not true. If we look at the ability to, it's really, I think Robert Hockett is a professor in Cornell, and Rohan Gray, they've shown how quick and easy it would actually be to set it up from a technological and operational standpoint. And then the idea that it wouldn't work or it has all these moral hazards, you could argue anything really, but I think one thing that we've seen from something like either the $1,200 check to every, or it didn't get to every household, but things like that, or the extension of the unemployment benefits by $600 a week, that showed. And then what we saw was somehow magically what we call the economy didn't just crash and burn, that by putting money into individuals' accounts through millions and billions of little interactions here and there, things work out because the vast majority of us do want to take care of each other, our families, our friends, our neighbors, and that argument of moral hazard doesn't hold ground.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, like my master's is in social work, and of course we had to analyze a lot of social service programs. And one in particular always sticks out for me, the SNAP or food stamp program, which, by various measures puts back, $3 to $4 into the economy for every dollar that we spend on it. But some of those lessons can be extrapolated to many, many other programs. And one of the things that I just like to say to simplify it to people is, like, when you give poor people money, they spend it. When you give richer people money, they put it in the bank or they invest it, and it doesn't have a substantive impact on the real economy. Poor people's money has an impact on the real economy and beyond the economy, which is something that, like, I get really frustrated talking about when I know that people are dying, when I know that essential workers are being exposed to COVID on a regular basis. But for them, it's the choice of starve at home without a job or, expose myself and my family to a virus that might kill me. That's a horrible choice, and we should not have to make them make it. But, poor people spend money. We are the real economy. A lot of the measures that we use to evaluate the economy are based on how well they work out for bankers or for affluent people. And I'm really one of those people who's in favor of alternative measures and really expanding, like, the Dow as a measure of anything that's within the scope of reality. Because, it really, to some degree, isn't. Don't get me wrong, it can tell you how good or bad, like, certain Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 companies are doing, and that can have a substantive impact on employment down the line. But a lot of the day-to-day changes really, really don't matter. But before we moved on, I wanted to talk a little bit about one aspect of the newest proposed stimulus that really pisses me off and really applies to us here at Move to Amend in our work for corporate accountability and to amend the Constitution to say corporations are not money and money is not free speech. The latest stimulus, it seems like cash payments, they've sort of settled on a number that's around $500 or $600 for most people. And then just like the $1,200 payment that you mentioned, not everyone will get it, once again. But then they've also added these corporate immunity clauses where, businesses who may have endangered workers in some way. And, this summer we read about it in particular, in meat packing and processing plants were epicenters of COVID outbreaks across the country. But beyond that, these places that employ essential workers, mostly low-income workers, mostly workers of color, mostly women, are basically looking for, and it seems like they will get, corporate immunity over lawsuits that employees could file to say you put me in an unsafe work environment unnecessarily, / for profit. And I think that's just disgusting. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I've got too many thoughts for this. I'll try to keep them short, but yeah, it's really just a despicable grab for power, because what we've already seen over the last few decades, and you could even argue the whole history of this country, this ebb and flow, but first, just the subversion of paying their fair share into the work by our corporate titans, whether it's the Apples and Amazons, or if it's fossil fuel companies, this, that, it doesn't matter the industry. They're actively actually breaking the law, but they know they're not going to be enforced because our IRS and SEC staffing has been going down for the last 35 years, I believe, where we would need to about 5x their enforcement staff to really take on the complexity of the cases that should be tried. And now what we're seeing is, so they did it with the money, which you could argue just sucks, but now they're trying to do it with real human lives. They're basically trying to say that for you all to get something that's going to be inadequate and only enough for a little bit, we're going to now start this re-entrenchment and putting our heels in the ground so that we now have a liability shield when it comes to direct human life and suffering. And it's just an untenable, just bold face, just it's despicable, really.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like some people think we're hyperbolic when we talk about things like the notion of the enlightened despot, or the notion that a king is given their chance to rule by God. I feel like we treat corporations in a very similar way, and we look out for their welfare more than we look out for any individual human within the United States, or any group of humans within the United States. And we think kings are bad, but like if we look at things comparatively, I love some of the comparisons that I guess I've seen on Cracked and other places that do a little bit more of their research, but serfs and like plebeians had more time off than we do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing this come up on different talk radio shows, this idea of the divine right of kings really starting to infiltrate the decision making, almost blatantly so, where we need to protect these enlightened beings because they're dropping money and jobs on us. And it's obviously completely false. But one thing that really heartens me, that if we can break away from this, is that I look at this just incredible upsurge of mutual aid networks being formalized, but also there's also the 10x that aren't formalized, where people generally just want to help each other. And that shows me, and that should show all of us, that just obviously, I don't think anyone listening to this would agree with the idea of the divine right of kings or corporate leaders or whatever you want to call them, misleaders, but that the alternative is not uncertain, that we know what would happen and we know that it would be better because we can look to things like whether it's mutual aid networks or any other social or environmental justice-based organization standing up for the rights of either themselves or the future generations, whether or not they themselves have kids, because it matters to us. And that alternative future is not unknown. It's very much known, and we know that it's undeniably better.
And we can also look to the example of other countries which have had a lot of things that for some reason we need to fight for, like a broader proliferation of worker-led co-ops where workers own actual companies, and that model is widely spread. Widely spread within the entire country. But then also, since like the mid 20th century, other industrialized nations have had things that would be akin to Medicare for all. And we don't have that because of the corporate power of our insurance companies. But when you talk about like the divine right of kings, which is the phrase that I was searching for, it makes me think about the titans that we spoke about in earlier episodes of Making Sense, like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who have made billions more much faster during this pandemic. And within the last 2 weeks, we found out like that a lot of these enlightened billionaires who really just seem more and more like mad scientists or evil scientists are moving their operations to Texas and getting it to a point where, on the federal level, they either pay no taxes or get a tax refund. And since they're all moving to Texas or moving their headquarters to Texas, they pay no state taxes as well. So basically, we as the residents of the United States, we buy their products. We fully fund the roads and the technological infrastructure that they use to make their businesses work, and then we pay them money for that privilege. We pay them we give them federal income tax returns, and we don't charge them state taxes because it just feels that good to make these really great people happy. I mean, it frustrates me so much. I know there are only so many times that you can talk about these people. I know people get angry about it, but I do think there's that, what is it, Alexis de Tocqueville quote where, so many people in the United States aren't really upset at the state of their caste system because they don't see themselves as poor. They see themselves as, temporarily deterred millionaires. And I think it's very indicative of where we are as a country, where we're just like, one day that's going to be me. And I want to be the one who, takes all the money from everybody and doesn't really give other people opportunities. I want to be the reason that, all of these single parent families have to, move out of their apartment and into their car. I mean, it's just, it makes me incredibly angry that we take it, and that we're not constantly angry, and that we're not constantly working to address that and the new or the neo divine right of kings. And it's mostly, once again, it's mostly men, and it's mostly white men.
Yeah, totally. And I think going back, you said to Tocqueville, there's also been other people that have visited the country over the years, especially after the Civil War, that have seen this pernicious, quite successful ability of the ruling class to keep everybody else fighting with each other and blaming each other for their problems, rather than putting the onus on the ruling class. And what we see in other democracies over the last 150 years is the ability to have a groundswell of people-powered movements that are directly focused at the top. And here it's maybe it will happen right now, but it is that time to break down those entrenched systems. And I know we want to talk about a couple of different ways to do that, and that are already in the works.
Yeah, and I think this is, perfect time, one, to give people a little idea of what public banking is very generally, but then to talk more specifically about the work you've done with Public Bank LA and the California Public Banking Alliance, and how some of the work that you're doing now can help us, democratize monetary policy to some degree, but also, provide a path out of what is still a financial crisis.
For sure. Yeah. Let me just talk a few minutes about public banks. Just give a real brief overview of just what they are, and then maybe we can go into some of what's been going on the last couple of years. But I just start by saying that, we deserve public banks because they bring democracy to what we call finance. They allow us to build public trusts. It allows us to take our money and the awesome power of money creation to directly benefit the projects and the people working day to day to build the collective good. Public banks are part of a broader push to make our financial systems be more democratic, be more responsive, do more values-based lending, which still makes economic sense if our economy is built from this notion of how do we center human well-being. And it really allows us to put the power to accelerate other priorities that we already have. So I see public banking not sitting as another one of many different social and environmental movements, but more as a tool to support and magnify the scale and scope of many, many social and environmental movements going on. And so it's taking this awesome power that banks have and bringing it to the level of where you have money that's kept local and where the public money and public credit is truly owned by whether it's a state, a city, a tribal nation, a community, or a nation at large, that it's owned by those people. So that when what we call profits are made, so when repayment of a loan is made, when interest is paid, it doesn't go to a small group of people, that it goes back into the public coffers, and it allows for this intergenerational transfer of wealth that has these measures of accountability and governance that allow people to have much more insight into what's actually happening, how decisions are made, and know that banks are using the ability to leverage money to benefit the public rather than shareholders.
I want to stop you there real quick and ask you something that I've heard a lot, and I'm sure you've probably heard. Okay, so public banks. What about credit unions? Like, how are these different? Why can't we just rely on the credit unions that we normally have? Why do we need public banks?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think so. One way to think about having a public banking system, Germany has one of the most robust ones as a country, but we do have 700 public banks around the world that hold close to $40 trillion in assets. So what we're saying first is nothing new, but the way to think about it is that the public bank, because we know things are relationship based. So who holds the relationships in communities? It's whether it's a credit union, a community bank, community organizations. The way to think of the public banking system is that they would support the ability for the credit unions, for the community banks, for the MDI, CDFIs to continue doing what they do best and do more of it and more directly reach the individuals and businesses. And then the public bank either buys loans off of the book so they can do more of it. They could provide guarantees, just different ways to take our public money and our public credit to support the activities of financial institutions like credit unions.
Great. So can you tell us a little bit more about just your work? And I've been following it and, very excited, whether that's been on the local level and LA City Council or on the state level. Think there's a lot of potential going forward, but even with the work you're done, like it seems like there's more work to do. But can you tell us, just first about some of your recent wins and, plans for the future and how that can benefit some of the groups that you just.
Yeah, definitely. The biggest one was last year, the passage of AB 857, which just in a sentence allows for cities, counties, and what are called joint power authorities. So think of things like utilities to form a public bank. It set the framework to do that, and it allows for 10 of those to be started over the next 7 years, I believe. You still have to go through that process, and we have probably 5 to 10 either cities or counties actively pursuing the start of a public bank through that legislation. So that was a big win. We've continued the conversation of public banks in Sacramento. We had a hearing on public banks generally a few weeks ago in the Senate. This is in California. That because we had almost had a big win at the early days of the outbreak of COVID to start a public bank in the state of California, which would have allowed the state to take some of the state savings and support the activities of cities and counties and government agencies that are providing the direct services that we're all wanting. And really, in a lot of ways, also decrease that uncertainty of as a provider of social services, am I going to get paid? How long do I have to hold and accounts receivable on my books until I can get paid. So it would have really done that. So we haven't gotten there yet. But another big win at the national level is that we have a bill in the House introduced by Tlaib and with co-sponsors AOC and several others. We were able to contribute to that. We worked primarily with Rohan Gray, who's a professor of law and does a lot of work in public banks, and also Raul Carrillo. And that really, when that does pass, when that day comes, it would be a huge transformation, because what it really does is it provides federal recognition of this idea of creating a public banking system. It creates the classification for public banks. It sets up the regulatory framework that would allow public banks to flourish. And so right now, and then what it also does is it doesn't make a single national, like we have the National Infrastructure Bank, but that's separate, right? This creates the framework for local and state public banks to be created in the country, have access to what we're calling the Federal Reserve window. And then also it speaks to some of the other movements that we're also a part of democratizing finance at an even more individual level. Things like what we call either Fed accounts, which fall under this category of digital wallets. So this idea that we talked about earlier, where every individual would actually have an account at the Federal Reserve. There's arguments of whether it should be directly at the Treasury or at the Federal Reserve. I don't think we have time to get into that today, but it's a really sophisticated short framework of how public banks and more movements to democratize finance would be federally recognized and also supported, so that there would be grant money available from the Treasury to allow cities, states of any size, so they'd be irrespective of size. So it's not like California would get more than Wyoming, but that money would be available for the startup process, and even hopefully initial capital, so that they could start doing more lending.
And you mentioned North Dakota earlier. And I remember around the time of the last financial crisis, and it seems like we have at least one or two a decade, which could be preventable. But I remember reading a whole lot of stories around that bank in particular, and the ability of the state to weather the crisis better than other states as a result. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we do bring up the Bank of North Dakota possibly more than we should, partly because it was created over 100 years ago, before what you can call the modern infrastructure and monetary policy and the modern Federal Reserve System. So it was created before this. The only thing it has in common with today is that it was created on the heels of a global flu pandemic in 1919. And it was created by grassroots organizers, mainly trying to divest from Wall Street and not have their loans be based on the whims of New York bankers. So, but other than that, it has very little in common with today, because there is a much more robust system set up that we have to take into account as we're designing something. So it is more complicated, but what it does show, and I think what we have right now in this year alone, is showing how a public bank could work, and not looking at, well, North Dakota is so small, California is so big. It's more just look at the mechanism of a state to be able to disperse something like the PPP loan program. And what we see is that, for one, they have the highest concentration of community banks and credit unions per capita of any state. So there's been much less of the agglomeration and because I think California has lost 25% of our local banks over the last few decades as they've been bought up by the big banks, but that we see that money was able to get into the hands of more businesses more quickly, because the public bank stepped in and provided a liquidity source for their frontline lenders, and also other credit support so that they can magnify its impact.
Thanks for that. Another question sort of along the same lines. I know we've seen Elizabeth Warren and other prominent progressive to progressive-ish politicians talk a little bit about postal banks. A lot of times they've been talking about them in terms of access, especially for rural communities where some of their local banks might have closed down or been bought out, and they just don't want to go to like the large conglomerate. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on postal banks.
Yeah, no, another great question. Definitely. So postal banks are really interesting right now because they have and did exist in the past. The Postal Service has, I heard somewhere, the highest consumer satisfaction rating of any organization you could say in the entire country. People love the Postal Service. They're everywhere. So they already have the infrastructure set up where with almost, you could say, a flick of a switch, they could become, they could provide basic money and financial services to every American across the country. Because right now what you have, and we talk about this sometimes, or quite often, is still immense both racial and economic inequality in denying basic financial services to primarily Black people and immigrants. And so if you look in some of the worst places are Miami, Detroit, Laredo, Texas, and the Bronx, where over 20% of residents still don't have bank accounts. And in areas like Cleveland, Nashville, and Atlanta, that goes up to 40%. And so it's both having those accounts, but then you think, well, what's the alternative? Like, is it so bad? And it's what when we hear payday lenders and other things like that, it's in most states now it's illegal because it is usury. And so the idea here is that something like postal banks could be a place where people can transact and be provided with money services right up front, one of which would just be directly receiving, say, their paycheck. Because we've heard those problems where because a bank is the recipient of an individual's paycheck, they actually have the rights to hold that money if an individual has some other debt, which is an egregious overreach of power, but they have it. And so a postal bank would be able to provide an alternative, and not only provide an alternative, but also provide an alternative in an already very trusted institution with branches across the entire country, including the most number of rural branches of any institution we have. And then it also opens the way, postal banking, to, because we start getting into a lot of privacy issues too, right? With different, whether it's cryptocurrency, this or that we're already seeing this with social media companies, transnational organizations, and certain governments monetizing individuals' data and even creating social credit scores. So we call those kind of like those algorithms that sit behind the curtain that decide increasingly decide people's access to credit and other things. And so it could even allow for the establishment of accounts where there is no personal identification to it, that you don't need it, that other than just a password, and it would have a limit, like say $500 or $1,000 per person, but it would allow for a complete anonymity for a certain amount of money, so people could do smaller transactions without having to turn over all their personal information and data to a massive corporation or the government.
One of the other reasons I like the notion of postal banks, though I must admit I need to do more research beyond the payday lending, which a lot of low-income people, across the country, if it's not payday lending, it's like check cashing services where you have to pay a fee to, cash a check rather than just deposit an NT or account. A lot of people, particularly this year, have been receiving unemployment. And more, a lot of the big banks are getting into the unemployment industry. And, you're issued a card, which for the most part, you don't have to incur a fee if you use our ATMs. But from a probability perspective, a certain number of people are not going to be able to find one of your ATMs. So it's just a means for banks to make money off of fees for unemployment, which I think is also disgusting. I think there is potential, if someone had like a postal bank account, for that to be a place where unemployment checks or any type of money that you receive from the government could just be deposited immediately. The other thing that concerns me, and I think there have been, a few great articles written about this over the years, is just how expensive it is to be poor at one of these traditional banks, where you might have forgotten, a bill that you paid, but you went out to eat, so you get an overdraft charge, and it's like, oh damn, I got an overdraft charge that was $20, but you don't get paid again for a week or 2 weeks, and you might have enough food at home to subsist. You might have enough gas in your car, enough money on your Metro card, so you don't really have to think about it that much. But the time goes by and you don't pay within a certain time frame, and you get paid again, and the fee doubles, and it just keeps doubling. So by the time that you get your paycheck, the bank takes, a fourth of it, a third of it, depending on how much you get paid, just based on these fees that multiply. And I think there might be some recourse in a situation where we had a postal bank where it was just like, you get an overdraft charge maybe, and then you can't use your card. Right now you have to opt into that type of service with a lot of our major banks, where it's like, if you don't opt in, we're just going to keep charging you overdraft fees, and we're probably not going to waive them even if you call. So I think that's potentially a way that a postal bank could help out a lot of people who just realize how expensive it is to be poor.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way of putting it, that it is really one of the major advantages that we would see with postal banks, that that in no stretch of the mind would we think that our postal system is going to charge these fees and make it so onerous to be poor, that it's going to be the exact opposite. And then also what you were saying about the checks going through the unemployment system, that was also another power grab, and just this continued process of trying to decrease trust in government. The system that we use for state level unemployment services was designed 85 years ago. It was last updated, I think, during the Carter administration. The RAND Corporation, which I think is actually based in Santa Monica, I heard an interview with someone from there. It's been known for 30 years that we need an overhaul of that system. So by choosing to disperse benefits through a broken system is just, it's just one of those things where it's a power grab, and because it could have been done through a much easier way than that. There was no reason that you had to go through, and also dropping it. Like, it's not like they told all the unemployment departments across the country, hey, in a year from now, we're going to start doing this. It was like, hey, we're going to do this tomorrow or next week. And it really just, and it hurts not only obviously the people working for those departments of government, but tens of millions of people trying to go through that process. And just, it's not just the financial, it's the psychological and social harm and trauma that's being intentionally induced by the decisions being made on how things like money will be dispersed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thanks for joining us today, Ben. We're almost at the hour. We usually go to about 45 minutes to an hour. So I just want to give you just a final moment to tell people how they can learn more about your work, maybe some websites that they can go to, anything they can do, particularly if they're in California, to be active and support the work of the California Public Banking Alliance, and things like that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think just to say thanks for giving this opportunity today. One way I think to also just think about the public banking is, whether it's a stitch in time saves 9, or, you patch a small hole in a roof and you don't have to repair your roof in 10 years. That's kind of how to think about providing credit in a time like now. I think so we're still working to develop this. We'll have it ready in about another month. But right now, the Democracy Policy Network, it's democracypolicy.network, and then search for the public bank page. There's a lot of really good information on there and a ton of hyperlinks. Vox, VOX, had probably the best overview of the national bill that was out earlier this year. And then go to the California Public Banking Alliance website. We have a link to every local chapter in the state, ways of getting involved either at the local level, wherever you're based in California, or at the state level. We're one and the same in a lot of ways, but I encourage each and every one of you to find both your local chapter and also contact us. We have people contacting us for whether it's things like podcasts or even ex-bankers being like, how can I get involved? I'm retired now. I want to be on your board, and we don't have one. But so please contact us, whether you're a graphic designer, a banker, a communications person, on the ground community organizer, anybody. Send us just a short message and say you want to help. We're really responsive and would love to continue building both our direct public banking work, but also just our coalition with other justice-based social and environmental movements out there.
Thanks for that. And I just want to reiterate from sort of a strategic and movement-based perspective, Move to Amend, we see ourselves as a part of a broader democracy movement. So the democratization of monetary policy and economics is just right up there with us in our sort of strategic plans and our focus as an organization. So we'd love to continue to talk and continue to have a relationship down the road. Of course, if you're watching this for the first time, if you're watching Making Sense for the first time, you can find more about Move to Amend and the We the People Amendment at movetoamend.org. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. We're on all the socials, though I don't think we got a TikTok because we're older. But we'll look into it. But please join us again for Making Sense every Friday at noon. I think if there's a holiday, we might run a rerun episode that's particularly good. But over the last few weeks, we've just been very thankful for a lot of very informed guests that can help us broaden the scope of education for the people both within our affiliates and our supporters. And, you can contact us at info@movetoamend.org. And once again, movetoamend.org for more information. And we'll see you next week.
Cool. And also, last thing I want to say, remember, you can also always call your local representative and tell them you support either something very specific, a specific bill, or this idea of public banks, postal banks, Fed accounts, or just democratizing finance. And it goes a long way when they hear from their constituents. But thank you so much for having me, Daniel. It's a great opportunity. Appreciate it.
And thanks for making the time to join us today.
Definitely. Anytime.